We're just going live.
I have the streaming notice now, so I think we're good.
Okay, that's good.
Do you think we should make some forest noises ourselves?
How good are your owl calls?
So we started the streaming. Let me
like 5 out of 10 owl call, I think.
Yeah, we're getting lots of people in. It'll take a couple of minutes for that to sort of stabilize, but that's completely normal. Okay, so that's good. I need to just perfect. Right. So it seems like we are on we are streaming properly on YouTube, and we are live on the actual webinar, and we're getting our participants in. Quite a few people joining us. That's really lovely to see. So welcome everyone. This is just a quick introduction from me. My name is Dimitra Femi, and I'm co-director of the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic here at the University of Glasgow. My specialism is on fantasy and children's literature, and I've also worked extensively on Tolkien, whose name is going to come up in the discussion in a little while, given his many numinous and wonderful forests, and of course the tree-like ends. And that's because today we will be talking about trees and fantasy and forests as we celebrate the launch of the Immanent Grove project. And as a Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic based here in Scotland, we're planting a tree in the Highlands for each of the graduates of our Fantasy Masters programme. You will hear more about the project in a bit, as well as the inspiration for the project's name and remit, but also about the enduring imagery of forests and trees in fantasy. So I'm just here, as I said at the beginning, to welcome you on behalf of the Centre and briefly introduce our three speakers. Just a few housekeeping things first. For your questions, as our speakers are in dialogue, please feel free to post your questions on the Q&A function. You can use the chat function to register reactions and share thoughts and discuss. I can already see it going as per usual, but with so many of us present here and you know, sort of juggling all of this activity, the questions should, you know, we will be taking questions from the Q&A, so that's the place to post them. And since I mentioned the chat, oh, you're already doing it. I was going to ask people to post where in the world you're watching us from, as we do every time, and I see that this is already happening. If you're watching us on YouTube, you can use the comment function there. Also, if you want to live tweet or share any reactions on Twitter or on any other social media, please use the hashtag Immanent Grove, was one word, and please tag at UofG Fantasy so that we can retweet you, etc. You will see me again just as we're wrapping up, and I'll give you a heads up on things coming up in the centre and news on how to subscribe to our mailing list and all of that sort of more practical stuff. Let me now, though, for now, welcome everyone, and let me introduce our speakers, and then you can get rid of me, which is a good thing in this particular case. So our speakers today, I have three colleagues really, two of my colleagues at the university and one of our PhD students. So first of all, Dr. Rob Maslen. Dr. Robert Maslen is my co-director here at the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic, and he's the founder of the Masters in Fantasy we've been running here in Glasgow since 2015. His original specialism, he started with a specialism in early modern literature and remains interested in the early modern fantastic, but he's written articles on fantasy, science fiction, Japanese anime, and published editions of Mervyn Peake's poetry. He blogs at the City of Lost Books, which I know has a huge following among quite a few people I can see in the chat. And his current research includes a monograph on Mervyn Peake and the rise of fantasy. Then my second colleague today is Dr. Matthew Sangster, who is a core member of the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic, and he's a senior lecturer in Romantic Studies, Fantasy and Cultural History. His recent work includes Living as an Author in the Romantic Period, just out from Palgrave, and projects on 18th century library borrowing, literary institutions, and the culture of the 1820s, and David Bowie, because he's an amazing guy like that. He's published also Mervyn Peake, on China Mayville, on fantastic visions of cities, and he was co-curator of the British Library exhibition on Mervyn Peake in 2011. At the moment, he's working on notions on history and community in fantasy literature and culture across a broad chronological span. He leads our Fantasy Across Media course for the Fantasy and Lit and supervises a number of PhDs working on fantasy authors, tropes, forms, and ideals. And one of Matthew's, Dr. Sangster's PhD students is our third speaker, who's going to start us today, and that is Lucy Holdsworth, who is in the third year of her PhD after having graduated from our Master's Fantasy program. And Lucy is working on divine abuse in modern depictions of Lucifer. It's a fascinating PhD, and there's a lot more detail on her research and her publications and grants on her website, on her profile on the university, which I will post in a minute on the chat. So welcome everyone once more. This is time for me to stop talking now. So I will pass the baton over to Lucy, first of all, who's talk us through the Immanent Grove project. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitra. I just want to start by seconding Dimitra's welcome and thank you to so many of you for being here from all across the world. It seems like we're going to be talking quite a bit about the way community sort of links in with this. So it's lovely to see that the roots of this community spread so far across the globe. So thank you for joining us. So I'm going to talk a bit about the inspiration for this idea, where it came from. And it primarily came out of two things for me. Glasgow itself and my own sins. So I will talk a bit about those in turn. I'll start with Glasgow. So one of the things I've always loved about our city is how green it is. And when I first moved here, it had the most green spaces per person of any city in Europe. Unfortunately, I think we've now lost that title, which I will come to in a bit. But you still can tell how important the green spaces are to Glasgow. My own walk to university was certainly very green. I used to live up in Mary Hill. I don't know how many people know that area, but to get to the university that way, you walk down a beautiful canal route with loads of young trees shading your walk, down past a dim and mysterious little grove at the top of Queen Margaret Drive, and then through the Botanic Gardens and then into the university itself. So nature has always been a huge part of my university experience. I knew where to look for foxes and deer on the way, made friends with squirrels, and managed to tempt birds to come sit on my hands sometimes, which made the sort of fantasy experience all the more magical. And then one day the grove at the top of Queen Margaret Drive just vanished. The birds and squirrels were all gone. All the trace of the vibrant ecosystem that I had loved so much had been scraped away to make room for construction. And soon after that, I moved to my current flat, which is also surrounded by trees, almost as tall as my building. And I would show you them out the window, only they've been torn down to build a car park now. And this seemed to be a recurring theme, that everywhere I went in Glasgow, trees were being torn down. Hence, I suppose, the fact that we've lost our title of having the most green spaces per person. So this sort of deforestation in Glasgow seemed to be part of a worrying trend. And every tree that I saw cut down sort of felt a bit like a betrayal almost, not just of me and the fact that I sort of love this nature, but of the future. You know, we know the state our climate is in, and we're still cutting down trees at an alarming rate. And every time I went past these broken stumps, I felt like I started to hear echoes of Treebeard's voice from Lord of the Rings, when he's just come across the devastation wrought by Isengard. There are wastes of stump and bramble where once there were singing groves. I have been idle, I've let things slip, it must stop. The actual method of addressing this came, as I mentioned, out of my own sins. So not long ago, I attended a conference in Canada, and I felt incredibly lucky to have that opportunity. But the flights and the air miles that sort of racked up left what my partner called a carbon handprint on my soul, which I really kept feeling. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that academia's expectations of attending conferences far and wide on a regular basis are incredibly unsustainable. And very few universities seem to be doing anything to address this, really. Obviously now in the advent of Zoom conferences, things are a bit different, and hopefully we will manage to keep some of that moving forward. But there still is this sort of culture of racking up the air miles, I guess, for academia. So despite our best intentions, we are part of the problem. So I came across the charity Trees for Life while looking for a way to offset my own flight to a conference. And it suddenly occurred to me that while I don't have any power over Glasgow's dwindling green spaces, I do have access to a community of people who, like me, were raised on stories of the beauty and magic of forests, who also cared really deeply about the environmental future of Scotland, and probably felt a similar unease about academia's role in undermining that, and would love the opportunity to do something that would work against that. And the more I thought about it, the more it seemed obvious. Trees and forests hold such a special place in fantasy. And I think at least fantasy and activism go hand in hand, really. This is something I talked a bit about on the blog post about this event, if anyone has read that. So do excuse me for repeating myself, but I think it's a point that bears repeating, really. Fantasy is often dismissed as mere escapism, but Le Guin reminds us that escape is the direction of freedom. And that could be freedom from tyranny, from oppression, from bigotry, from inequality, or in this case, freedom from fossil fuels, freedom from climate change, freedom from what is essentially a curse that began long before we were born, that many of us feel powerless to stop in the same way that many epic fantasies have that as sort of the crux of their plot. And it's an evil that's too big for any one hero to defeat, but requires our collective magic to overcome it. So it felt like a really good fit to me. So at this point, I sort of brought the idea to Matt. So I suppose at this point, I'll hand across to my co-host to sort of talk about their side of how this amazing project came about.
It was a really good idea, therefore we did it. I mean, I think really we had very little to do but agree that that was a beautiful idea, and that it was a particularly good time for us to be thinking about our master's graduates now that the program has run for 5 years, and that the cohort, the owls who were with us in 2019-20 had a really difficult time because of the beginning of the pandemic. So it would be particularly nice to do something for them. And so yes, we went ahead. We secured some support, and we are now planting a tree for all of our Immanent graduates, and we will plant trees for PhD graduates as the time comes. And those, I think Dimitri could probably link the site, but the owls are all rooted, or all conceptually rooted in the Highlands. I'm not sure whether the charities quite got round to planting the trees yet. It's probably a bad time to plant trees in the winter. I suspect they have to wait for the spring. But they are planted with their graduation year and their messages, and we are now trying to reach out to all our previous cohorts of graduates. You may know we give the graduate cohorts bird names. It started when Rob was experimenting on the first year and calling them the canaries, but that has now gone through. So Lucy is a noble phoenix, one of the second year of the students, and then we had the ravens, and then we had the merlins, and our current year after the owls, who were last year, is the nightingales. So hopefully we will be able to go back and backfill the Highlands with trees to sort of commemorate all of our graduates in previous years, and we will also be able to plant trees for the nightingales when the time comes.
I suppose I should point out that it was actually the canaries themselves who identified their name, because they felt as if they'd been sent down a mine ahead of the miners to test for poisonous gases. So I suppose right from the beginning we had a kind of ecological element in the names that we gave to each of the cohorts. My suspicion is that if we're thinking about the Immanent Grove as a forest, then probably the merlins and possibly the nightingales are going to be happiest in it, of all the different cohorts that we've had, owls and phoenixes and all the rest of them.
You can see a phoenix forest problem, I think. There's definitely something there.
Definitely the phoenixes are not going to hang out too much in the forest, but I think they only set fire to themselves at the end of their lives. So the forest has 100 years of healthy growing to do before that.
And there is that sort of thing that forests often need burn to refresh the soil and these sorts of things. So maybe the phoenixes will find a space in the forest after all.
We will welcome them with open arms. Now, my feeling is that this is the first of many events in which we'll be discovering the way that fantasy has anticipated some of the anxieties of the 21st century in its early years, and how it can address some of those anxieties, especially around the area of climate change, but all sorts of other areas as well. So we hope that some of the readings that we're going to go on and do will give examples of the ways that fantasy can raise consciousness And I say that in the broadest possible way. It raises consciousness. I mean, one of the things I liked most that Tolkien said was that it makes you see things as if for the first time and reinvests them with an enchantment that they might otherwise have lost through over familiarity. And that surely is one of the crucial things that we need to do in the current climate. So that's what we're going to proceed to do. And we're going to read you extracts from certain key works, in our view, which talk about trees and forests. And we're going to talk about them a little bit as well, to give a kind of fantastic context to the notion of the Immanent Grove and the Trees for Life project, which it supports. So we're going to begin with a few readings from Ursula Le Guin, who always identified herself as one of the most enthusiastic writers in science fiction and fantasy with relation to trees. So she said about her first story set in the world of Earthsea, her fantasy environments that she created in the 1960s. The first of the short stories she wrote for that was called The Word of Unbinding, and she said, "It reveals a certain obsession with trees, which once you notice them, keep cropping up throughout my work. I think I'm definitely the most arboreal science fiction writer." And anyone who's read The Word for World is Forest will agree with that. "It's all right for the rest of you who climbed down and developed opposable thumbs and erect postures and all that. There's a few of us still up here swinging," she went on. So I'm going to also remind you of a quotation that I used in the blog post about the Immanent Grove, just because it's a very beautiful quotation, also from Ursula Le Guin. And each of these comes from her introductions to her great short story collection, The Wind's 12 Quarters. Here's what she says about the inward forest that we all inhabit. "We all have forests in our minds, forests unexplored, unending. Each of us gets lost in the forest every night, alone." I love that notion, that idea. But I thought it was also useful to give you a sense of where we got the title, The Immanent Grove, from. Now, a number of you will remember this from the stories of Earthsea, that the Immanent Grove is to be found on the island of Roke, which is the island where the wizards of Earthsea are trained. Now, I'm going to take my description of the Immanent Grove from the third of the Earthsea books. And in various ways, it's appropriate because this third book is about an ecological catastrophe, which is threatening Earthsea at the time. All the magic seems to be draining out of this world in which magic is one of the ways in which people live, in which people work, in which they cohabit, whether it be the formal magic of the wizards trained on Roke, or whether it be the other kinds of magic which especially women are known to work on the different islands of the extraordinary archipelago known as Earthsea. So I'm going to read you the description of the Immanent Grove, which she gives at the beginning of that book. And as I read, you have to remember that something is profoundly wrong in the grove. The wizard who spends his time there, the master patterner, has noticed that various patterns, various shapes that are being woven within the grove by spiders, by trees, by plants, and by other life forms are being disrupted in a certain way. So not only is the magic of Earthsea being undermined by some malign force, but also the structure of it, the very way it's put together, is in some way being damaged. This sounds familiar, doesn't it? Somewhere to the west of the great house of Roke, and often somewhat south of it, the Immanent Grove is usually to be seen. There is no place for it on maps, and there is no way to it, except for those who know the way to it. But even novices and townsfolk and farmers can see it, always at a certain distance. A wood of high trees whose leaves have a hint of gold in their greenness, even in the spring. And they consider, the novices, the townsfolk, the farmers, that the grove moves about in a mystifying manner. But in this they're mistaken, for the grove does not move. Its roots are the roots of being. It's all the rest that moves. And it seems to me that we might think about ourselves as moving around a lot, while the trees struggle to maintain their place in the world which they feed and support, and which they find is gradually being snatched away from them. I had one more quick Le Guin quotation, which I'll give you, which is from one of the most beautiful representations of trees that Le Guin gives us. And that is the description of the trees that are used to build the rafts of the people of the open ocean. These are people who live entirely at sea and only come to land once a year in order to construct their rafts. No land, we are the children of the open sea, says the head man of this population. Aaron looked at his keen face. He looked about him at a great raft with its temple and its tall idols, each carved from a single tree, great god figures mixed of dolphin, fish, man, and seabird. At the people busy at their work, weaving, carving, fishing, cooking on raised platforms, tending babies. At the other rafts, 70 at least, scattered out over the water in a great circle, perhaps a mile across. It was a town, smoke rising in thin wisps from distant houses, the voices of children high on the wind. It was a town, and under its floors was the abyss. Do you never come to land? The boy asked in a low voice. Once each year, we go to the long dune. We cut wood there and refit the rafts. That is in autumn, and after that, we follow the grey whales north. In winter, we go apart, each raft alone. In the spring, we come to Balatran and meet. There is going from raft to raft then. There are marriages, and the long dance is held. These are the roads of Balatran. From here, the great current bears south. In summer, we drift south upon the great current until we see the great ones, the grey whales turning northward. Then we follow them, returning at last to the beaches of Emma on the long dune for a little while. This is most wonderful, my lord, said Aaron. Never did I hear of such a people as yours. My home is very far from here, yet there too, on the island of Enlad, we dance the long dance on Midsummer Eve. You stamp the earth down and make it safe, the chief said dryly. We dance on the deep sea. An example of Ursula Le Guin encouraging us to think of alternative ways to interact with nature, among which trees are only an integral part. So I thought both of those quotations launched us rather nicely into the discussion of trees that will ensue. And I think that the other two both have favorite passages they'd like to share.
That was beautiful. It's been far too long since I've read the Earthsea books. I forgot how much I loved them. So I was going to talk quite briefly about Terry Brooks's Shannara books, which were very formative for me, but have sort of fallen out of favour in the last few decades. He's a bit of a mixed bag, but because they're not as popular now as they were, I'll give a little bit of background on the books. So on the one hand, the success of the Shannara books made it clear to a lot of publishers that fantasy could be commercially viable. So we have a lot to thank him for in the number of fantasy books that sort of come after that. And on the other hand, they are often accused of being a shot-for-shot rip-off of Lord of the Rings, and to a certain extent that is fair. But in the second book, the Elfstones of Shannara, which is what I'm really going to talk about, the trees in, he really finds his feet and starts to explore his own lore a bit more, fusing this post-apocalyptic, possibly post-nuclear Holocaust Earth with medievalism and magic in a way that set my teenage heart on fire, really, and gave me a real love for fantasy that has lasted till now. So I have a lot to thank it for. There is a particular tree in that, the Ellcrys, which I think is really worth thinking about for a bit. And if you haven't read the book, massive spoilers ahead. There's no way to talk about the Ellcrys without this. So I do apologize, but you have had about 40 years to read it. So hopefully you won't be too angry at me. So the Ellcrys is this magical tree that sits at the heart of the elves' land, that acts as like a focal point, both a lock and key for an ancient spell to keep demons out of creation. She's lived for thousands and thousands of years before humans existed, through their domination of the earth, through nuclear war and the subsequent extinction event, into the present medieval society that's emerged after that extinction event. And when Brooke starts the novel, the Ellcrys is dying, meaning the spell that holds back the demons is going to die with her. And the only way to restore her is to plant a new Ellcrys. The problem with this is that it's revealed that the Ellcrys must be a living woman who is transformed into the tree, and loses all her humanity with that. So I've just got a quote that I'd like to read out from that book. Pale silver moonlight spilled down out of the heavens and washed the summer night. Sweet smells and comforting hums rose out of the dark in slow, dizzying waves that floated and danced in the warm breezes and brushed the hedgerows and stands, the flower banks and the bushes of the garden of life. Dappled shadows layered the garden's colours in oddly knit patterns of black and white. Tiny life forms that awoke with darkness skittered and flew with sudden, invisible bursts that left no trace of their passing. In the midst of it all, solitary and ignored atop the small hillock that overlooked the homeland of the elves, the wondrous tree they called the Ellcrys continued its slow, inevitable march toward death. The long journey had begun to take its toll. The perfect beauty that had marked the Ellcrys in health was gone. The perfect symmetry of her form marred and broken. Silver bark peeled away from trunk and limbs, black and rotting, hanging in strips like tattered skin. Blood-red leaves curled tight with wilt. A scattering of those had already fallen, dotting the earth beneath, dried and withered husks, rustling with the wind. Like some withered scarecrow set atop a pole above the fields, she stood stark and skeletal against the night horizon. So there are a lot of reasons why I love that quote, but I love the Ellcrys more generally. That quote in particular, it really shows that the moments of dread in this book aren't the demon attacks or the monsters, although there are a huge number of those. It's when spots of mold are found on leaves. It's when a new patch of bark falls off. It's when branches start to look withered, which I think is a beautiful way to really put the focus on the ecological devastation rather than the sort of hacking and slashing that we might expect in this kind of novel. And the other reason that I think the Ellcrys is such a beautiful creation is because she's very complicated. She seems to be this sort of incredibly good, almost eternal protector who sacrificed herself to save the earth. But she's also deeply sinister. Amberly, the woman who ends up turning into the new Ellcrys almost against her will, is terrified of her because she knows that the tree wants something terrible from her, to empty out her personality somehow. And this image of spidery branches reaching into your mind and emptying you out, demanding this terrible sacrifice, is appalling, and really reminds us that nature is terrifying despite its importance and despite how much we need it and how much it does protect us. It's not this cutesy, good sort of pastoral image we've constructed. So yeah, there's a lot to the Ellcrys. Its timelessness as well. It remembers things in terms of geological ages. It communicates with these images that it sends to people's minds, but all of the images it sends are of places that haven't existed for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, meaning that the language of the trees is completely unintelligible to everyone else, which I think is a beautiful idea. Yeah, so that's Terry Brooks.
I think some lovely connections with Le Guin as well, and sort of there is this. I guess it makes me think about Yggdrasil, the sort of world tree, the sort of roots of everything, and that's there in the Ellcrys and also in the Immanent Grove to some extent. That trees somehow have a connection to the what's essential about the world, but are not themselves completely equivalent to that thing. They're not everything. They are more specific. They're a sort of means of making that connection between a particular place or a particular person and a larger thing.
Somebody just mentioned, I think it was Helen in the chat, that the passage you read made us instantly start thinking of Naomi Novik's novel Uprooted, which has a similar representation of a wood which at the beginning is represented as unproblematically and unambiguously monstrous. It's a seriously terrifying thing, which transforms human beings into trees and kind of goes around wreaking appalling damage on everything that it comes in contact with, especially human beings and their environments. But gradually, as the story goes on, it begins to emerge that there is a long history behind the enmity of the wood, and especially the queen of the wood and the human beings who have constantly been attacking it. And this is wonderfully woven into a kind of or analogously woven into the story of as much as anything else, parts of Europe which have been similarly kind of have had turbulent histories and have found it very difficult to find a mode de vivre, a modus vivendi, a way of living that satisfies both the natural environment and the human inhabitants of the world. But also, it also becomes a kind of the wood itself becomes a representation of the damage of the past as much as anything else. I didn't know about Brooks's use of a post-apocalyptic setting for the Shannara sequence, and that makes me immediately vastly more interested in reading it than I have been before. So you've certainly converted me to wish to go and look at it.
I was thinking while you were speaking, Matt, about other sort of similarities between the quotes that Rob has put out and the ones from Brooks. I do think there is this common theme of this death and rebirth being a really important part of nature, and sort of refusing to allow that process to take place causes terrible, catastrophic, I've lost my words, consequences for the environment.
Yeah, no, I think that's often there in trees, that they do get tight. They do get tight because they live and die like us. Some of them in similar scales, and some of them on far longer scales. I guess some in far shorter scales. But they do seem to sort of they do make people think about time and temporality in all sorts of interesting ways. I guess I can segue into my reading if people don't have things, because I guess in some ways my bridge in is to sort of talk about how trees have this sort of longer tradition in literature. So the going into the forest, which is a sort of a place of change, a potentially threatening place, but also a potentially revelatory place, or a place of difference, but not necessarily a wholly negative difference, has that really long thing. I remember there's a wonderful bit in Gawain and the Green Knight where he goes out into the forest and he fights with trolls and wolves and various other things while he's passing between the two ostensibly quite civilized castles. So the civilization in those castles is hiding various things. In some ways, I'm surprised that Rob, as a Renaissance person, didn't take us to the Forest of Arden. We could have had As You Like It as part of this, I guess. Or there's sort of all sorts of forests that people run mad in. I think Orlando and Orlando Furiosa runs mad in the forest. I'm sure Lancelot runs in the forest and runs mad in the forest, and most of the knights quest through it at various points. As a romanticist, I want to sort of go to a slightly later version of the forest, and but the forest used to sort of think about time and eternity. And I want to have a poem, because we don't have poems so much in these talks, and I thought that would be nice. There's also an appropriate poem for a couple of reasons. I'm going to read Ode to a Nightingale, which is Keats' poem. As people will know, Keats died 200 years and a day ago today. And as you may also know, our current cohort of fantasy students are the Nightingales. So this has a nice connection. It also has one of my favorite scenes of being in the forest, but not seeing it, but smelling it, which we will get to in a moment. My heart aches, and a drowsy numbness pains my sense, as though of hemlock I had drunk, or emptied some dull opiate to the drains 1 minute past, and Lethe-wood had sunk. 'Tis not through envy of thy happy lot, but being too happy in thine happiness, that that thou, light-winged dryad of the trees in some melodious plot of beechen green and shadows numberless, singest of summer in full-throated ease. Oh, for a draught of vintage that hath been cooled a long age in the deep-delved earth, tasting of flora and the country green, dance and Provençal song and sunburnt mirth. Oh, for a beaker full of the warm south, full of the true, the blushful Hippocrene, with beaded bubbles winking at the brim and purple-stained mouth, that I might drink and leave the world unseen, and with thee fade away into the forest dim. Fade far away, dissolve and quite forget what thou among the leaves hast never known, the weariness, the fever and the fret, here where men sit and hear each other groan, where palsy shakes a few sad last grey hairs, where youth grows pale and spectre thin and dies, where but to think is to be full of sorrow and leaden-eyed despairs, where beauty cannot keep her lustrous eyes, or new love pine at them beyond tomorrow. Away, away, for I will fly to thee, not charioted by Bacchus and his pards, but on the viewless wings of poesy, that the dull brain perplexes and retards. Already with thee, tender is the night, and haply the queen moon is on her throne, clustered around by all her starry fays. But here there is no light, save what from heaven is with the breezes blown through verdurous glooms and winding mossy ways. I cannot see what flowers are at my feet, nor what soft incense hangs upon the boughs, but in embalmed darkness guess each sweet wherewith the seasonable month endows the grass, the thicket and fruit tree wild, white hawthorn and the pastoral eglantine, fast fading violets covered up in leaves, and mid-May's eldest child, the coming musk rose, full of dewy wine, the murmurous haunt of flies on summer eves. Darkling, I listen, and for many a time I have been half in love with easeful death, called him soft names in many a mused rhyme to take into the air my quiet breath. Now more than ever seems it rich to die, to cease upon the midnight with no pain, while thou art pouring forth thy soul abroad in such an ecstasy. Still wouldst thou sing, and I have ears in vain, to thy high requiem become a sod. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird, no hungry generations tread thee down. The voice I hear this passing night was heard in ancient days by emperor and clown. Perhaps the self-same song that found a path through the sad heart of Ruth when, sick for home, she stood in tears amid the alien corn. The same that oft times charmed magic casements opening on the foam of perilous seas in fairy lands forlorn. Forlorn. The very word is like a bell to toll me back from thee to my sole self. Adieu. The fancy cannot cheat so well as she is famed to do, deceiving elf. Adieu, adieu. Thy plaintive anthem fades past the near meadows, over the still stream, up the hillside, and now 'tis buried deep in the next valley glades. Was it a vision or a waking dream? Fled is that music. Do I wake or sleep?
Fantasy is very deeply rooted in Keats's fancy, I think. And there's Geoffrey Robinson, one of our colleagues at the University of Glasgow, has pointed out the way that fancy, this kind of skipping kind of faculty, which unlike Coleridge's imagination, is inclined to jump from one topic and subject to another without ever attempting to reconcile or form them into a kind of constructed world, is something which Geoffrey Robinson associates with experimental poetry, of which Keats he sees as one of the early exponents, and which he sees as continued in the modernist experimental poetry of the 20th century. So I'm very glad you read that, among other things, because it's a wonderful tribute to the current generation of the fantasy master's graduates who have called themselves the Nightingales.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm always a little bit unsure whether we can claim it as a fantasy poem, but reading it, you do spot it is full of elves and fairies and it's haunting things at edges. I think the sort of point you're making sort of about fancy, and the fancy also sort of sits with that idea of negative capability, the sort of space of being in uncertainties, which we might link to certain theories of the fantastic. It's quite like Todorow's hesitation between uncanny marvelous explanations. And it's quite like the forest itself, I think. The forest is a place where you can go to think and be in doubts, where the light is dappled, and where you might sort of be in a sort of a space where you can think in other ways and see other things, perceive other times, and imagine other worlds, as Keats does in that poem.
It reminds us that the roots of fantasy could easily be traced to the Romantic era. Among other things, the kind of impulse to kind of rethink things from scratch, which I suppose is kind of impelled by the same impulse that was leading people to revolutionary thoughts in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, sort of rethinking society from scratch. A little bit of that thinking, that re-enchantment that Tolkien talks about in an entirely different context, is something that we could do more with in the 21st century, I think.
Yeah, I think the tree is a good metaphor for fantasy in some ways, and that there's a lot more beneath the ground than immediately meets the eye. And fantasy does have deep roots going right back to the dawn of language. I mean, what when you start calling things fantasy is an interesting question, and probably something for another event, because there are all sorts of points where you can start calling things fantasy. But definitely, it does go back and down into the soil in all sorts of interesting ways.
Well, we've been talking about the way fantasy is in dialogue with the past, and I'd like to go on to my next reading, which is from a book which some of you may know. I don't know whether it will show up here properly, but it's by Patricia MacKillip, and it's called Alphabet of Thorn. And it's all about a young woman who works in the library of a great castle, and she works as a translator there. So scholars bring her manuscripts, and she reads the manuscripts and she translates them into the contemporary language. And one scholar brings to her a manuscript which is in this very bizarre script, which, when deciphered, emerges as a kind of history, a history of two figures who are mythological in the world that Patricia MacKillip has created. They're called Axel and Cain. Axel is a great king who conquered vast tracts of land. Cain is the enchanter who supported him with his magic. And as she begins to interpret the alphabet of Thorn, the pain and damage, the bloodshed, and the torment of past years comes home to her, and the translator begins to understand the past in a way that she hadn't done before. In the process, mysteriously, in the course of this novel, the past comes alive and begins to interpenetrate with the present. And always it's associated with woods, with trees, with the growth of thorn through things, and the damaging, but also extraordinarily rich and diverse sort of environment that thorn offers to those who care to enter into it. So it's a very beautiful book. Like many of Patricia MacKillip's books, it's a book which is at times extraordinarily, almost impressionistic in the way that it's written. It's like a painting. And I'd like to give you a passage from it to give a sense of how that painting looks. This is about the queen of the realm where the translator works. And she's wandering through the wood, wondering about various influences that she's detected at work in her queendom. Now, the wood in early morning was utterly silent. She walked carefully through damp leaves, around tangles of bramble and vine, trying not to disturb the stillness. She could not see the sky, only green and shadow woven thickly above her, yielding not a scrap of blue. She breathed soundlessly. So did the wood around her, she felt. It seemed a live thing, alert and watching her. Trees trailing wisps of morning mist, their faces hidden, their thoughts seeping into the air like scent. It was, she thought, like being surrounded by unspoken words. She stopped moving, stood as silently, listening to them, trying to understand their silent language. Their words lay all around her, she realized slowly. Each fallen, mouldering leaf, each twist of ivy along a branch, each outstretched twig in a thicket made a shape in the air, in the eye. What did they say, she wondered, entranced, and tried to breathe in the language of the wood, tried to take it in through her skin, as though she too were hidden within leaves, within bark. And one of the things that the novel suggests is it's only by learning the language of the woods, being able to take it in through our skin, making ourselves in some sense one with the woods, that we will be able to counter the damaging, destructive, imperialist and colonialist inheritance that we've brought down to ourselves through history, and which we discover every time we open old books, that and resistance to it, which the figure of the enchanter Cain begins to represent as we go on reading the Alphabet of Thorn by Patricia McKillip.
Patricia McKillip's one of those writers who just doesn't get enough credit, partly because she doesn't write long series, but she writes beautiful, short books that are mainly independent. She has one trilogy, which is wonderful, called The Riddle Master of Head, but she's written a whole sort of series of sort of shorter fantasies, and they're sort of wonderfully quiet in various ways, and they're also sort of, they have a lovely commitment to non-violent ends. They do not tend to end in battles or wars or the sorts of conflicts that even when they're hinted, they're sort of, she's very good about sort of writing about how people get out of binds and clashes and those sorts of things. And I think Alphabet of Thorn, without spoiling it, has something of that towards the ending. My other particular favorite of hers is The Forgotten Beast of Eld, but you can pick up almost any Patricia McKillip book and be sure that you will see something sort of beautifully written and unfamiliar.
I have to admit, she's not an author that I've read, but you've definitely converted me. So I'll be going out and getting a copy. I love that idea of reading and writing through nature. It seems very sort of linked to the idea of reading the patterns in the grove in Le Guin. Very sort of linked to this idea of divination through nature as well, I suppose. You know, reading tea leaves is as old as time. Yeah, that sounds brilliant. I'll have to pick up a copy. So my next text that I'm going to bring before you all is a bit less serious, but I thought it would be nice to have a note of nostalgia and levity, I suppose. I'm going to talk about the Lorax, which needs no introduction. Firm family favourite. I love it just because it's so blatantly anti-capitalist, which makes my Marxist heart sing. It is sort of very, very specifically launching its critique at capitalism, I think, rather than generally anti-industry, because there's such a focus on the fact that no one needs a need, despite what the Once tries to convince everyone. It seems very much to be a specific critique of throwaway consumerism at the expense of nature, essentially the capitalist scene, which is a very complicated idea, but he somehow manages to explain that in a way that very young children can understand, which I think is an incredible feat. And I think this is also a really important text because of the way that it's been used in activism recently. Surprisingly, a huge number of signs at environmental protests have the Lorax on them, and things like "I speak for the trees," other quotes from the text. So I do think it's going to have a bit of a resurgence and have some more cultural relevance than we might perhaps expect for a children's book. So I'm going to just read the ending of the book for you, because it ends on this wonderful message of hope and a call to action. So this comes from just after the very last truffle tree has been cut down and there is absolutely nothing natural left in the landscape at all. Now all that was left beneath the bad smelling sky was my big empty factory, the Lorax, and I. The Lorax said nothing, just gave me a glance, just gave me a very sad, sad backward glance as he lifted himself by the seat of his pants. And I'll never forget the grim look on his face when he hoisted himself and took leave of this place through a hole in the smog without leaving a trace. And all that the Lorax left here in this mess was a small pile of rocks with one word, unless. Whatever that meant, well, I just couldn't guess. That was long, long ago. But each day since that day, I've sat here and worried away. Through the years, while my buildings have fallen apart, I've worried about it with all my heart. But now, says the onceler, now that you're here, the word of the Lorax seems perfectly clear. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. So, catch, calls the onceler. He lets something fall. It's a truffler seed. It's the last one of all. You're in charge of the last of the truffler seeds, and truffler trees are what everyone needs. Plant a new truffler, treat it with care, give it clean water and feed it fresh air. Grow a forest, protect it from axes that hack, and then the Lorax and all of his friends may come back.
I taught at the university, at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire for a little while. And there was a wonderful professor there called Bill Cook, who was a massive fan of Dr. Seuss and would quote him on every possible occasion. And it seems to me that there couldn't be a better symbol of the green movement than a Lorax, as anything by Dr. Seuss, in fact.
Yeah, I think there's a sort of really lovely sort of sense there of fantasy as a way of sort of dreaming a better world through other kinds of connections. And that's, I think that connection between trees and thoughtfulness comes through, and lots of the things that we've been talking about. The sort of, I guess the sort of the stillness of trees relative to us makes us project contemplativeness onto them in various ways.
I think that you had a final quotation there, Matt, that you were going to turn to. But before you do, I just had a very quick observation, because I wanted to bring in the man whose drawing I have behind me. Yeah, I don't know whether anyone recognized it, but it's a picture by one of Matt's and my own favorite artists and writers, Mervyn Peake. And Mervyn Peake was something of a tree obsessive as well, and writes about them magnificently, especially in Gormenghast, when he describes Titus's visit to Gormenghast Mountain. But I thought I'd read you a little poem, because it's short and because it tells us about the connection between human beings and trees, and how intimately we are associated with one another in character and appearance, as well as by other means. So here it is. It's called With People, So With Trees. With people, so with trees. Where there are groups of either men or trees, some will remain aloof, while others cluster where one stoops to breathe some dusky secret. Some complain, and some gesticulate, and some are blind. Some toss their heads above green towns. Some freeze for lack of love in copses of mankind. Some laugh, some mourn. With people, so with trees. I like the way it speaks to maybe the kind of awakening of a recognition of the kind of association between human beings and the green world around us, which may be gradually emerging out of the torments, the thorns, if you like, of the COVID situation.
You've thrown us off schedule. I see you couldn't keep to two. You decided to interject Peake regardless. But I guess anarchy is a thing that can happen in forests. In art, and everything can be turned upside down. So this can
there
be
is no
tolerated
plot in the forest, exactly.
Yes. I don't know. I had problems picking a second passage in some ways. I really wanted to talk about the People's World Tree Library from Kelly Link's Magic for Beginners, although I'm not sure that is so much about trees as trees being in the background. But it's a book I love, and I'm always happy to talk about. And there are a number of other sort of forests that occurred to me. I'd have loved to find a good section of Robin Hobb, who I think writes very well about all sorts of different kinds of forests. But then it occurred to me that if we didn't do Tolkien, Dimitra would hunt me down afterwards and kill me and bury me in the forest. So Tolkien will, I think, have to be our close. I had two different Tolkien passages to do. I had one calm passage and one spooky passage, but I was considering asking which people wanted, but I've decided I want to do the spooky passage, so I will do that one. I will just mention that after this, we're very happy to take questions. There's some really interesting threads going on in the chat, but it's slightly hard for us to track those necessarily because they scroll off the screen. So if people have questions or ideas about trees that they'd like to introduce, please do stick those in the Q&A box, and we will be very glad to address those if we can, or mention them and then sort of mumble for a bit if we can't. So I will do a passage from the Hobbit. So this is the point where Bilbo and the dwarfs Gandalf has just left, where they're entering Mirkwood. They walked in single file. The entrance to the path was like a sort of arch leading into a gloomy tunnel made by two great trees that leant together, too old and strangled with ivy and hung with lichen to bear more than a few blackened leaves. The path itself was narrow and wound in and out among the trunks. Soon the light at the gate was like a little bright hole far behind, and the quiet was so deep that their feet seemed to thump along while all the trees leaned over them and listened. As their eyes became used to the dimness, they could see a little way to either side in a sort of darkened green glimmer. Occasionally a slender beam of sun that had the luck to slip in through some opening in the leaves far above, and still more luck in not being caught in the tangled boughs and matted twigs beneath, stabbed down thin and bright before them. But this was seldom, and it soon ceased altogether. There were black squirrels in the wood. As Bilbo's sharp, inquisitive eyes got used to seeing things, he could catch glimpses of them whisking off the path and scuttling behind tree trunks. There were queer noises too, grunts, scufflings and harrowings in the undergrowth, and among the leaves that lay piled endlessly thick in places on the forest floor. But what made the noises, he could not see. The nastiest things they saw were the cobwebs, dark, dense cobwebs with threads extraordinarily thick, often stretched from tree to tree or tangled in the lower branches on either side of them. There were none stretched across the path, whether because some magic kept it clear or for what other reason they could not guess. It was not long before they grew to hate the forest as heartily as they had hated the tunnels of the goblins, and seemed to offer even less hope of any ending. They had to go on and on, long after they were sick for the sight of the sun and of the sky, longed for the feel of the wind on their faces. There was no movement of air down under the forest roof. It was everlastingly still and dark and stuffy. Even the dwarfs felt it, were used to tunnelling, and live at times for long whiles without the light of the sun. But the hobbit, who liked holes to make a house in, but not to spend summer days in, felt that he was being slowly suffocated. The nights were the worst. It then became pitch dark, not what you call pitch dark, but really pitch, so black that you could really see nothing. Bilbo tried flapping his hands in front of his nose, but he could not see it at all. Well, perhaps it is not true to say that they could see nothing. They could see eyes. They slept all closely huddled together and took it in turns to watch. And when it was Bilbo's turn, he would see gleams in the darkness around them. Sometimes pairs of yellow or red or green eyes would stare at him from a little distance, and then slowly fade and disappear, and slowly shine out again in another place. And sometimes they would gleam down from the branches just above him, and that was the most terrifying. But the eyes that he liked least were horrible, pale, bulbous sorts of eyes, insect eyes, he thought, not animal eyes, only they are much too big. I thought we should probably have a spookier forest. Although a spookier forest for the hobbits, who knows whether the spiders have a lovely community among themselves, which these sort of terrible interlopers are intervening in. I mean, Tolkien's not very keen on spiders, so perhaps not within the conventions of the world. But I think that there's been points in the chat made about the potentially anthropocentric view of trees, that we do a lot of projecting onto trees and sometimes are not so keen to let them just be trees in their treeness. But I guess that's what fantasy does in some ways. It imposes and imagines empathies and cross connections and kinds of talking that would not be possible otherwise. If sometimes it should perhaps let things be silent, then perhaps it's better to imagine conversation than imagine it's impossible.
The greatness of the trees in Mirkwood is the way that they evoke the perilous realm, the forest of romance, which Tolkien talks about in his essay on fairy stories. He always reminds us that stories are dangerous places, that you can never quite be sure where they're going to go. They're not necessarily always in the control of the storyteller, and the reader can never be certain that they're going to be led in the direction they expect to go. And a forest is a wonderful metaphor for that quality in a story.
You should bring your other background in, Rob, which shows that sort of forest in Lewis's imagining.
One of the most wonderful forests in fantasy is the wood between the worlds in The Magician's Nephew by C.S. Lewis. One of the things that's most remarkable about it, I think, is this idea that the forests are a place where there's no direction, there's no sense of progress through time in one direction. And that, again, is something that they could teach us very easily, I think. So in The Wood Between the World, it's a place that two young children are sent to by a wicked magician in Victorian London. And when they arrive there, they find that this wood is full of pools like the ones behind me. And each of those pools is, as it turns out, the entrance to a world. And what that means is that the wood beyond the world, but between the worlds, is a kind of in-between place or threshold, a place from which you can choose to go in any direction you like. Sometimes into worlds that are delightful, other times into worlds which are absolutely terrifying. But no particular path that you choose is the right path, the progressive path, the path that leads in the direction that you should be going. Instead, it's a kind of an infinite choice of your own. And that notion of directionlessness is present in the idea of the errant knights and ladies of medieval romance. It's present too in stories like Robert Holdstock's wonderful novel Mythago Wood, into which you enter in quest of certain things or people, but through which you stray and are transformed by the process of straying and wandering. So I like that directionlessness which this wood represents. And it's certainly something that Mirkwood represents as well.
You mentioned the medieval romances there, Rob. While you were reading that quote, Matt, I definitely got the sense of the echoes of Sir Orfeo, the idea that if you stumble from the path, you'll end up in the other world where terrible things can happen to you. Absolutely.
We've been getting lots of sort of suggestions about trees. We had Mythago Wood come up. We did think about Mythago Wood, but we are potentially saving that for a later arboreal event in the year further on, which our colleague Richard Stacey is very fond of Mythago Wood, and we might possibly tempt him to come and talk to us about it later on. We're getting interesting stuff from the Hyperion cantos. The space trees are a really interesting thing. There's a couple of different imagining. Saga has a spaceship that is a tree as well, the comics, and there's this sort of idea and the sort of really giant trees, sort of even bigger than redwoods, the sort of trees that reach across solar systems. So there's a sort of way that they can fit into science fiction imaginaries of various kinds as well. We have one question at the moment. It's if there's something you would like to introduce or that you would be interested to hear us address, it's a bit easier for us to see if you can type it into the Q&A box rather than the chat box, because that sort of reserves it for us rather than sort of potentially pulling it off the top of the screen. We've got a question which probably Dimitri is better placed to answer than we are, but I will read the question out and Lucy and Rob can think about it. Is there a good book, whether a monograph or collection, that deals with the role of representation of trees and forest in fantasy and the fantastic, preferably including myth and folk tales more generally, preferably not focusing on a single author, but as broad as possible in terms of authors and age, etc. Stroll's Forthammer has a chance to stump us there, I think. There's a good collection on Tolkien and trees, Tolkien, Trees and Cities, that came out, I think, from Walking Tree Press, very appropriate one for woods. I think otherwise the stuff on that might be rather more distributed. It seems like one of those really obvious fantasy monographs that someone is going to have to write a book on fantasy and trees at some point, but also because there's not actually all that many monographs on fantasy specifically. I think that one's still open if someone wants to do that as a project. I don't know whether you have any other thoughts, Rob.
No, I think that I mean, such a book may exist, and the one that you indicated sounds as close as I've come across in my experience. There are certainly quite a few essays about it, yeah, I mean, but I very much like, I think it's territory that's open to be explored, and there's an enormous amount of material that one could use. Some of them stories which are being mentioned in the chat. Other ones, slightly older ones. I love some of the ways that George MacDonald, for instance, who has been mentioned in the chat, uses trees in a whole variety of ways, in a whole range of his different romances or fantasies for children and for adults, especially perhaps in Fantasties, where they're both delightful places filled with small, rather kind of twee fairy creatures, which are sort of the flower fairies, and also filled with menace, with the monsters such as the alder and the and more motherly trees such as the beech tree, which he describes weeping, and so yeah, I mean that tree is one that I would very much like to read, and there are plenty of people I think who could write it extremely well.
There's some points in the coming up in the chat there. There's quite a lot on sort of trees and fairy tales, and I think I was thinking a bit about Marina Warner's work and about Bruno Bettelheim. I think there's also quite a lot about trees in literature more broadly, and a lot of the literature that's brought up in conversations about trees is fantasy literature. So there are books about woods in medieval romances, and there is Shakespeare criticism on what the Forest of Arden does and what happens in A Midsummer Night's Dream when you go into the woods. And there's also sort of the sort of whole tradition of that the woods as a place of change. I guess the Sondheim musical Into the Woods, drawing on fairy stories, is a critical work in some respects, and bringing some of that stuff together and thinking about what the woods is doing as a space. So there's definitely stuff on trees and literature. Whether, I don't know, it would be interesting to think about whether fantasy is actually quite close to the sort of, whether fantasy does specific things with trees beyond extending them and extrapolating them, or whether actually it's quite close in some ways to what literature in general likes to do with the idea of the tree. I see Laura's been pasting things about how the affinities between books and trees in German, but even in English, but the pages of a book are leaves. So there's that sort of strong sense of connection between literature and growth, forest growths.
I'd really highlight Sarah Maiten's book Gossip from the Forest, if anyone hasn't come across that as well, which really sort of closely links specific forests to the fairy tales that they've inspired across the UK and Europe. It's a really good read if anyone is interested in that.
Dion in the chat is doing a PhD on forest ecology and fantasy fiction. I have a feeling that might be with my friend Will Tatterstall. So this book is perhaps on the way, which is very exciting.
Do we have any further questions that you'd like to ask? Do we have any that have been picked up? For the most part, what we're getting really, we've got some gossip from the forest that Elizabeth mentions by Sarah, and I think that was what you were referring to, wasn't it, Lucy? So yeah, that would be a very good starting point. And I think there are plenty too as well. I'd really like to see here. Oh, Dion has responded to us and says that she's in the first year of her PhD. I'm actually assuming that Dion is yes. She's in the first year of her PhD and is working on forests and so on, and would like anyone who's interested in forests themselves to get in touch and converse with her.
There was a request further back for any other trees that we could think of. I think we've been sprinkling in the trees as we go through. So I mentioned Robin Hobb, who I don't have my Robin Hobb books with me locked in my flat at the moment, where I can get to far fewer trees than I would like. So I didn't have the chance to go through those. But Robin Hobb is very good at forests, all sorts of kinds of forests. There's the Rain Wilds, which is her sort of I guess, semi-tropical forests, and there's lots of fine oak forests in the 6 duchies. 6 duchies, 7 duchies? I think 6 duchies.
Speaking of the of Robin Hobb, there's a very good question in the Q&A from Michelle, which is about whether there's a difference in trees and forests in fantasy rooted in North America versus those in the UK and Europe. I think that's such an interesting question. It goes to the roots of a question I'm always asking myself, concerning what are the differences between North American fantasy and European or other fantasies from all around the world. But in particular, I guess I've thought in terms of British fantasy, because that's one that I'm deeply familiar with. But does anyone have a response to that? Is this something that either of you have thought about? The distinction between the way trees and forests are handled in North America and Europe or the UK?
I think there probably is a difference there in various ways. Sort of some of the other books that were occurring to me were things like Emma Boole's War of the Oaks, which is one of the early urban fantasies. It's about a band. It's a lot of fun, but it also is sort of dealing with those kinds of connections. And I was talking with Demetra about Terry Windling's The Woodwife, which is a book deeply about trees, but also about trees in the American Southwest rather than anything else. I guess there's American fantasy that's keen on redwoods and these sorts of things. I think probably the sort of characters of a nation's trees do determine some extent the fantasy stories that are told. There's also the sort of deforestation. I think forests are possibly nicer in British fantasy than they would be in German fantasy, where primeval forest lingers longer. Definitely, we've had Naomi Novik's Uprooted mention. That's thinking about the sort of forests of Central Europe. It sort of appears to be its touchstone rather than woods or something along those lines, although she uses wood as the term. It's something grander and more sprawling. So I suspect that the way that cultures think about forests depend quite a lot on the forms of their trees and how many of those trees survive at the point that the work's being written.
I've not done any research into this, so everything I'm going to say is purely speculative and to be taken with a large handful of salt. But the kinds of texts that I've seen talking about trees, particularly in Appalachian literature, seem to be far more sort of skewed towards horror kind of things than I might expect from British fantasy. This idea that there is something ancient and almost Lovecraftian that might live in the woods that are so vast that no one would ever know that it got you. Again, this is unresearched and purely from my own spattered reading, but that might be something.
We have a question for you, Lucy, I think, about the ties between fantasy and activism. So whether you could expand on the ties between fantasy fiction and calls to action, which I guess is another aspect of the project, although I don't know.
It's something I'm really, really passionate about, and something that I really hope we as a centre can sort of start to do more with. But I really feel that fantasy is the first step of all activism, because you have to imagine a world where things are different. And it's only when you've sort of created this fantasy world that you can start to see the steps towards it and think about how you might get there and start to plan ways to imagine the world for better. So we've imagined a world in which academia and environmentalism can work together, where ecological devastation can be overcome by the bonds of community that we've created, which is a really beautiful thing. But I think this goes much further than just environmentalism. There are so many examples of fantasy being used in activism in the last decade in particular. If you think about the protests in Hong Kong in support of democracy, huge swathes of people were using the hand symbol from the Hunger Games to symbolize their rebellion against a sort of authoritarian, regime, I guess. There are so many examples in particularly protests in America where Leia has been on signs as a symbol of women in the resistance. There are so many signs talking about children being raised on Harry Potter and the idea of Dumbledore's army and bringing that into their lives, and a refusal to back down, inspired by that. So I do think that fantasy and activism are very, very closely related. And I hope that we will start to see more research in this area, and perhaps more activism from fantasy and academia as well.
Yes, so we say with Dr. Frankenfurter, don't dream it, be it, but add the caveat, you probably have to dream it first, and fantasy is a good space to do that in.
This is something that's being pursued, among other things, by our colleague Rhys Williams, who is working on the relationship between fantasy and the notion of being able to imagine alternative futures of various kinds. Now, obviously, that's very often associated with science fiction, but interestingly, it's something that's also being increasingly associated with fantasy in various ways. And the example of the Shannara series that Lucy gave us earlier demonstrates the way in which fantasy can kind of imagine directions for the future, which are not the ones that one might expect oneself to go if one is concentrating on sort of conventional structures of progress and scientific advancement. Though I don't really want to use Shannara as the major example of that, because I don't know it yet, though I will know it soon. We have some other examples of activist fantasy. You've given us a number there, Lucinda. Those are superb. Matt, do you have any in your mind at all, or is this is something that we can pursue? Maybe it's another thing that we need a monograph on.
Perhaps so. I think it. I think it would be once you are done with Lucifer, Lucy, it might be maybe a second book there. But I don't know. I guess it's important to acknowledge that fantasy can be used for deeply conservative ends as well. That not all dreams are progressive dreams, and that sort of we wouldn't want necessarily be too utopian about the space of fantasy. But I guess in some ways, sort of because fantasy imagines the world as it isn't, there is something I guess sort of intrinsically sort of discontent or potentially utopian there, although in some ways that utopia might be a turning back to a lost past rather than projecting forward to a better future. And there's a lovely question. Sorry, Rob, go ahead.
I was going to say, it's interesting the way that Tolkien's fortunes have moved around in the course of time. I think, in many ways, the activist sort of aspect of fantasy is very largely, it's entirely really in the hands of readers and what readers do with those fantasies. And in Tolkien's case, he was always in my early days dismissed as a profoundly reactionary writer, somebody who was profoundly conservative in his instincts. And there's a great deal of truth to that picture of him. At the same time, as time's gone by, he's begun to be seen as, in some sense, prescient, as a kind of prophetic figure, recognizing the demolition of the world that he loved, the world of the natural world that he felt very close to, and looking for ways of articulating resistance to that demolition. Most obviously, maybe in his representation of Saruman and the way that the Treebeard and the Ents deals with the threat coming from Isengard. So yeah, I think the way that we read fantasy is a crucial element of the process of making it into something which is a call to activism.
I mean, Tolkien is also, Tolkien probably, if you had to place his personal political ideology, is conservative, but with complications and caveats to some extent. But he is picked up by the counterculture for a reason, and the works don't always reflect perhaps the ideology of the man. They do, and there are ways in which there's sort of some wonderful progressivism in Tolkien. I mean, the whole point of Lord of the Rings is no one can save the world on their own. If you try, you're probably going to make the world terrible in various ways. The ring is the temptation to give you an individual vast power, and it's shown that always goes wrong. And the sort of, even the characters like Aragorn, who seem to be the sort of the saviour figures. And to some extent, Aragon's very clear that his plotline is a secondary plotline. What matters is the quest. And the quest would absolutely fail unless people work together. It's a sort of that combination of Frodo and Sam and Gollum and their kindnesses and interactions that lets something positive happen at the end of Lord of the Rings. So I think there are interesting things about collaboration, and there is that sort of point about nature and how preserving nature is preserving something for everyone. That sort of idea of a commons, which I think is quite important for fantasy in general, but also quite personally important to the sorts of things Tolkien's doing.
I wanted to mention another lovely question that's come in the question answer. That there've been several more. One is from Vaibhav, and is something which makes me think about the Encyclopedia of Fantasy. But I'll read the question first, because even as a question, it's rather a lovely statement. Does the anatomical structure of a tree make it strangely fitting for fantasy? Rooted in the ground literally on one hand, and on the other has diverse colors and shapes of leaves and fruits. I think that's a gorgeous quotation. I'd like to steal it recklessly and go off with it and use it in other contexts. But it does remind me of something that was said by John Clute in the Encyclopedia of Fantasy, which is that fantasy has taproot texts which go deep into the past. One such taproot text might easily be Keats's Nightingale. Another would be several of the medieval romances, which have fed into the great fantasies of later time. You might go all the way back to Norse myth and the tree of Yggdrasil, a whole range of different texts which have contributed to the structure which is fantasy. One of the things that's most wonderful about contemporary fantasy studies and the people who are reading fantasy, even fantasy publishing, is the recognition of the sheer diversity of the leaves of the fantasy tree, and the way that there are sort of representations of forestry and trees in a huge variety of writing that has perhaps not been given as much attention as it should have been done in the past. I'm thinking of one of my favorite writers from the 1950s, Amos Tutuola, whose second novel is called My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, and looks at the forests of the spirit world in Africa and in his religious world that he represents in that novel, and in his first novel, The Palm Wine Drinkard. But there are all sorts of other great examples. One that I was thinking about using in the course of this discussion was Nalo Hopkinson's great science fiction novel, Midnight Robber, which represents a planet which has been colonized by peoples of the Caribbean, who have bequeathed a variety of Caribbean cultures to the inhabitants of that planet. And many of those cultures are deeply associated with trees and inhabiting trees, living with trees in various ways. And that makes me think about the way that our discussion of forests is mediated by what we expect. So the difference between a UK forest and a US forest, or a Caribbean forest, or an Indian jungle is, for me, often sort of mediated by the language that we speak of it in. I know as a child, I probably thought about many American forests as if they were UK forests. And once you start to read as an adult, you begin to recognize the different forms that forests and woods take in different cultures. And that's something that we're discovering more and more about with each passing decade.
We've got a question from Dion, who occurs to me has been recklessly gendering, which I will try and avoid doing here. So how do you see the role of scientific discourse around trees and forests as influencing or being influenced by some of the fantasy works mentioned this evening? And how important is scientific accuracy in fantastic representations of trees and forests? I have, I guess, a quick answer in that I guess it depends on what and the answer of that's always going to be, it depends. Although I think in some ways, fantasy doing imaginative things with trees without trying to be scientifically accurate takes you to some really interesting places. I'm thinking about Rob Maslen's book Underland, mainly because it's the place where I encountered the idea that all the trees the trees in the forests are connected together by networks of fungi and other kinds of organisms in the soil, which is a fairly recent, I think, discovery in scientific terms, but it's something that fantasy writers have known for a long time, or thought that they've known for a long time, that the trees can communicate with each other in various ways, connected, that they're not individual, they also do something collective. I guess that's also inherent in the language, the trees in the wood kind of thing, that the group does something else. So I guess in some ways I think there's got to be a dialogue there, that yes, if fantasy is making monstrous things out of trees, it's important to recognize that those things are monstrous and not judge trees too harshly by the things projected onto them. But also I think that there can be sort of positive aspects to the way that fantasy does imaginative things with trees that might potentially sort of drive science in various ways, or might sort of cause us to investigate certain things or to think in certain ways. And I think Rob Maslen does a wonderful job about this, sort of in talking about the wondrous nature of this research. There's a wonderful write-up of him and someone who's doing this work on trees and finding these amazing new things, and the excitement of that moment of discovery. And it does feel like a visionary moment in some ways. I don't know, Rob, whether Rob or Lucy, you had something else. I'm saving Ian's question for right at the end. I have not forgotten it. But,
you've taken the words right out of my mouth. I was just going to talk about the fungi discovery. So yeah, no, I completely agree with everything you said.
I think that also that I wouldn't want to put off people from writing about trees except in scientific terms. And in terms of the importance of scientific accuracy in fantastic representations of trees and forests, this is something which it depends on the level or the direction of your world building activities. So some people might feel that scientific accuracy was immensely important. Others might feel that it's fundamentally important to represent them in the way that is appropriate to the sort of point of view of the person that you're writing about. So some people walking through a forest will be able to say, I'm walking through a beech wood, and now I'm moving in among birches, silver birches, and here are some oaks. They'll be able to identify some transformations that are going around them, even in fairly crude terms. Other people will simply see trees and become increasingly spooked by trees, like Snow White in the wonderful sequence in Disney's first full-length feature film. So you're going to find that there are different perspectives, different ways of understanding trees and responding to trees. Perhaps it's one of the things that fantasy can do superbly well, is to sort of move between these different perspectives, and I guess a full understanding of trees possessed by the writer is going to be a great advantage. At the same time, to be honest and recognize that most of your readers will not possess such a full knowledge is something which can also feed into the fantasy text and enrich it in certain ways.
Shall we take Ian's question, let's get controversial, best tree in fantasy, as a sort of closing note for this discussion? Do either of you have views on this?
It's so hard.
It's tough. Treebeard is pretty good. I do like Treebeard. I think he has. I don't like all of Tolkien's songs, but I like Treebeard's song. But the Entwives song is excellent. I also like Miyazaki's trees. I think Ghibli trees are wonderful, particularly in Princess Mononoke. That is an excellent forest. It's very good at being quiet, and it's also very good at having the right sorts of noises. So that's an exceptionally fine fantasy.
There's also the great camphor tree in My Neighbor Totoro, which it must be one of the contenders for greatest tree. I was going to choose for mine, because I'm sure my answer would be different with every single question that was asked me. Every time I was asked that same question, it would come up with a different answer. Today, my answer is a science fiction story by Ursula Le Guin, which is called Vaster Than Empires and More Slow. And it's about a man who is an empath and therefore can feel all the emotions of anybody that he comes in contact with. A little like one of the characters in the Winx TV series on Netflix at the moment. And it's an extremely painful condition to have, because he's constantly being bombarded by emotions of conflicting kinds. So eventually he finds his way to a planet in which there is a sentient tree. In fact, there's only one tree, and it's interconnected right across the entire planet. So Le Guin anticipates the book that Matt was referring to. And of course, the empath decides to stay there. It's the perfect place for an empath to live.
Yeah, we've got lots of lovely suggestions in the chat. We've Justina mention of one of your favourites, Rob, vaster than empires and more slow. Lucy, do you have an answer, or is this question?
I do. And now that I've thought of it, I can't believe I didn't read some quotes out from it. But House Hawthorne in House of Binding Thorns. I don't know how many people have read that, but it's a sentient house that is embodied by this horrifying sort of thorny tree that sort of every now and then sucks people into it and sucks the life out of them. It's so wonderfully Gothic. Yeah, I just love it. I think it's great.
Elliot de Bodard is the author there. Dimitra briefly vanished from our screens, but she is back now, and we are at the end of our time. So I think we always knew that conversation was likely to overrun, but I think perhaps at this point we should draw things to a close, and we should thank everyone for listening. We hope this has been interesting and worthwhile. It has been mainly a ramble, but that I think is appropriate for passing through forests.
Absolutely. Right, that was absolutely amazing. And it's just so frustrating that I couldn't just do my usual sort of, jump up and down and clap and all of these things like you do in real life events, but there we are. But yeah, what an amazing range of texts were being brought in today, from children's literature, children's fantasy to sort of intrusion fantasy to whole, trees and forests as portals. All sorts of texts went through my head as you were discussing. I think Laura mentioned Tolkien's Lift by Niggle, in which a tree is a representation of a whole mythology, of a whole sort of building of an imaginary world in a very allegorical relationship. And I was thinking also about the Gruffalo, which starts, a mouse took a stroll in the deep dark wood, very, very important text for children's fantasy. And, the book I'm working on right now for my ICFA paper, which is Upton Sinclair's The No-Mobile, which is all happening in the Californian redwood forests. And, again, you have this very early protest in some way, sort of voice for the trees there, as we saw the Lorax and Lucy's talk. Clearly, we're not finished here. We've got a lot more work to do on forests and trees and fantasy. So this is just, some initial discussion really here. And I am saving as we go the chat so that we get a sense of, what other texts people would like to discuss, because there will be a follow-up. Clearly, this is we just scratched the surface here, haven't we? So before I thank our speakers, I have a few announcements as per usual. I'm going to do a very long sort of cut and paste on the chat, which hopefully will give you all the links of the stuff I'm going to talk about. So in terms of centre, big activities coming up, I want to first of all mention our online course on fantasy called Fantastic Texts and Where to Find Them, which is now open for enrolment. That's an accredited level 2 course, which will happen online, possibly for the only time this time. So, if you're not going to travel to Glasgow for a summer course, that might be your chance. And also a big development that I sort of mentioned already quickly in the chat. Matt, Dr. Matthew Sangster, myself, and Professor Brian Atterbury are co-editors of a newly launched series on fantasy academic series with Bloomsbury Academic, and I've got the link there for you. So yes, if anybody is writing that book on trees in fantasy or anything to do with any of the topics we talked about, and you're working on a monograph or an edited collection, we'd be very happy to hear from you. And that's a dream. Rob is also on the board, as are other members of our centre, but also people from across the world, including Australia, the USA, Europe, etc.
We've also tried to make it so that those books become affordable by genuine people. A lot of academic books, including the book that Dr. Le Guin and I've just published, are enormously expensive, but only bought by libraries. And when we were sort of talking with Bloomsbury, one of the things that made us really keen to do with a series of them is that they have promised that while they will start the books as expensive hardbacks, within a year of being published, they'll be available in a paperback for somewhere around £20. And at that point, the ebook will move to the cost of the paperback. So your research can be read by fans and your family, as well as academic librarians and people studying things in institutions.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Matt. That's absolutely crucial because, you know, academia is not doing great with these sorts of things more generally. Okay, then in terms of next events, then we've got two things happening in March. On the 16th of March, we have a special Creative Conversations event, which is a collaboration between the creative writing team here at the University of Glasgow and the regular Creative Conversations event. So this one's co-hosted with us, and it will be hosted by Rob Maslen, and it's actually a book launch of Oliver Langmead's Birds of Paradise. And Ollie did our fantasy MLit, and he's now doing his PhD with a creative writing team on fantasy with us. So we're very, very proud of his first, novel, and very, very much looking forward to introduce it to all of you. There are the link there will take you to the Eventbrite, and there's also links to where you can buy signed copies. And then after that, on the 25th of March, those of you that are Tolkien fans will know that date pretty well, because that's Tolkien Reading Day. And this year, this is something that's been organized by the Tolkien Society over many, many years. This year we're collaborating to run together as a series of online events, because clearly we can't do it in any other way in the circumstances. So the link to the Tolkien Society blog there already has the registration links for the Zoom events on the day. There's also going to be a lot of online and social media activities and ways to interact with the themes. And the theme this year is hope and courage, which again, given our circumstances and the lives we all live at the moment, is very, very apposite. And then after that, the big one for us is GIFCON 2021. That's the Glasgow International Fantasy Conversations, our annual conference. And the theme this year is Beyond the Anglo-Centric Fantastic. So some of the questions that were asked here are also quite relevant to this. The call for papers, of course, is now closed, so that the program will be announced pretty soon, but there will be lots of spaces, free spaces for people to join us, to just attend, ask questions, interact. So again, keep an eye on this for when the registration comes up. We have already announced our first keynote, Xie Zha, who's based in China, and there's some very, very exciting keynotes coming up as well. So again, keep an eye out, watch this space for further announcements. And finally, the last two links I've got there are the link to subscribe to our newsletter, which I guess most of you here have already done so, and you've had the notification for this and other events. But if not, this is the way to sign up and find out about what we're doing first. And finally, the Get Involved link on our website that has all the links to our social media, to our Discord, which is a very lively society, and where you can continue conversations from our events. So that's it. That's it from me. So thank you again very much for joining us. So thank you so much to Lucy, first of all, for bringing this idea to us and for proposing this event and for making the Immanent Grove actually happen. Matt, who actually was instrumental in making everything work clockwards and helping us get the funding and get the whole thing underway in an orderly way. And Rob, of course, who the founder of the Masters, from which our students are graduating, for whom we're planting those trees, and also my co-director and generally leader of ceremonies and an amazing, knowledgeable person about all things fantasy. So thank you all so much, and thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you soon at our next event, I'm hoping. All right. Thank you, everyone.